Don't let that flag hit the ground.
Americans love a winner.
History began on July 4th, 1776. Everything before that was a mistake.
And I'm gonna stay right here and fight for this lost cause.
And I cherish all of the freedoms that we got, including the freedom, the right to burn the flag. But I also got the right to bear arms, and if you burn mine, I'll shoot you.
Welcome to the Unapologetically American Podcast. Of late, many famous Americans are being considered for possible cancellation. We are going to battle those sentiments with this podcast. As we learn more about American history, I hope you will develop a sympathetic and nuanced view to those that came before us. I'm not perfect, you are not perfect, and those that came before us weren't perfect. But that doesn't mean that they weren't great. That doesn't mean that they didn't push the envelope of possibility. America has been shaped and influenced by some of the most radically individualistic people in history. We should celebrate our history and know it like the back of our hand if we want to truly know who we are as a country. If you love life, if you love liberty, if you pursue your happiness every day, then you are in the right place. That may sound a little hokey, but maybe some good old hokiness is what we need right now. Everyone has a story. Here at Unapologetically American, we want to hear it. Today, I am going to be talking about someone from America's early history and, spoiler alert, an individual that becomes one of 8 people to be considered an honorary U.S. citizen. I'm not going to use his real name at first because I want you to get to know this individual real well before judging them. If you know your history, you might figure out the identity of today's historical person. Without further ado, let's talk about Marquey Mark. Marquey Mark was born in France to a noble family. His family had a rich military history that stretched all the way back to fighting side by side with one Joan of Arc. His paternal family claimed that one of their ancestors found the crown of thorns that adorned the head of Jesus Christ during the Crusades. On his mother's side, he was descended from the commander of the Black Musketeers, the personal guard of the French king. Few families in France could boast such a wildly fascinating and honorable lineage. Marquey Mark never knew his father. His father died in battle when he was 2 years old. This devastated his mother, who fled to Paris, leaving Marquey Mark to be raised by his grandmother. The tragedy of his father's death is an important moment that greatly influences his life and will be something we will return to. To complicate matters, the family was even aware of the British officer who killed Marquey Mark's father. At the age of 11, our hero leaves the countryside and goes to Paris to receive his education and to be trained in the art of war. He is enrolled in a program for future musketeers, and at the age of 14, he becomes an officer. A marriage was arranged with another prominent French family. The young couple met frequently and fell in love. Marquey Mark moved in with his in-laws and continued his militaristic education. Here is where history and speculation meet. Marquey Mark was becoming more and more aware of the turmoil in the British colonies and the reaction of the British monarchy. He and other officers discussed it frequently and wanted to aid the colonies. Historians argue whether Marquey Mark's motivation was initially pure and the pursuit of liberty, whether it was rooted in his desire to fight the British as revenge against his father's death, or even just wrapped up in notions of chivalry. What became painfully aware to many was that Marquey Mark's talk about helping the colonial cause was rubbing many prominent people the wrong way. His in-laws sent him to Britain to work with the French ambassador to the crown, who happened to be his uncle-in-law. However, he was so mouthy to King George III, he was sent back to Paris. This led to the French king proclaiming that no French officer were to help the American cause, and specifically stated by name that this applied to Marquey Mark as well. Using his own money, Marquey Mark purchased a boat and set sail to America. Now, once again, history gets foggy here. The French people very much supported the American cause. Historians debate whether the French crown initially did or did not. It seems likely that they did, but we're very worried that it would stir up tensions and lead to more war with Britain, possibly in France itself. Remember, Britain and France are quite close to each other. Now, Marquey Mark's family was very much against the choice, and the theories ranged that they A, did not want to anger the French king, B, they were concerned about his safety, he's a very young man, and C, that they saw this as essentially career suicide. However, at the age of 19, Marquey Mark arrives in America. He lands in South Carolina to avoid the British blockade and travels to Philadelphia to meet the Continental Congress. Marquey Mark was not the first French officer to arrive in America, and he wouldn't be the last. So many had arrived without military experience or knowing English that the Continental Congress started to ignore them. Marquey Mark had the door slammed in his face initially, until they realized that this young man was the real deal. It certainly helped that a letter from Benjamin Franklin praised him as well. Marquey Mark soon met George Washington, and there was almost an immediate respect and admiration. This was the start of a beautiful relationship. Washington saw Marquey Mark as the son he did not have, and Marquey Mark saw Washington as the father he never knew. Remember this because it's very important. Marquey Mark was a camp aide to Washington, and he was just learning during this time, watching, observing, and many felt that this was an honorary role and that Marquey Mark was just there to bankroll the American cause. Marquey Mark did see battle at Brandywine, which also was the first battle for another famous foreign soldier, one Count Casimir Pulaski from Poland. The battle was a defeat for the colonial cause, but both Marquey Mark and Pulaski showed great cavalry skills, amazing daring, and they both aided in the retreat. Marquey Mark was wounded in battle, but was able to be with Washington that winter at Valley Forge. It is said that the young man relished the brutal winter. During the winter of 1778, news came from France that they were formally recognizing American independence. Marquey Mark fought other battles, but did request leave to return to France. He had started to advocate for an invasion of Britain led by the French. This and a desire to see his wife were his reason to return home. When he returned in February 1779, he was arrested for disobeying the king. This was a farce and done to save royal face. Marquey Mark was seen as a beloved hero, and the king was not mad at all. Together with the crown, he urged and planned an invasion of Britain. Spain had allied with France as well, and was also considered in on this plan. However, the plan was scrapped, and Marquey Mark returns to America with 6,000 French soldiers led by Rochambeau. Marquey Mark also had a son during this time, and he named his son after his friend and father figure, George Washington. Marquey Mark's return was much needed. The American cause was failing, and many defeats had caused malcontent. Benedict Arnold would soon defect to the British. Washington had Marquey Mark correspond via letter with local assemblies to raise troops, for he would soon arrive. This was a great help. Marquey Mark would see much wartime in the American South, especially Virginia. His youthful arrogance saw this as a slight. However, Washington had placed his greatest knight in Virginia for a reason. He was planning on capturing Cornwallis. Fearing exposing this plan, his communications were scant. Marquey Mark did communicate to France that his men in Virginia lacked provisions. The French crown did hear this and complied. In early 1781, Benedict Arnold would march and burn Richmond, Virginia. Thomas Jefferson was infuriated by this and placed a massive bounty on Arnold's head. The Virginia militia went after him. Washington had Marquey Mark go after him as well, and was given orders to hang Arnold if he were to be captured. Now, word at this time had reached Marquey Mark. The man that had killed his father was serving under Arnold. Arnold at this time had sent correspondence to Marquey Mark about a possible prisoner exchange. These letters were sent back unopened. Washington said, "Your conduct meets my approbation in refusing to correspond with Arnold." In short, Washington approved. Other soldiers said that if Arnold was captured, we should cut off the leg which was wounded in the country's service, and we should hang the rest of you. This inspired the Butte Monument at Saratoga National Park. In my opinion, those are truly some fighting words. I pause here to bring attention to something. Marquey Mark did not go on some Inigo Montoya from the Princess Bride quest for revenge. If this had been his initial spur to help the American cause, he had grown out of it. He was there to support the Patriots and to aid Washington, whom he loved greatly. The man that killed his father was later captured in New York and died as a prisoner of war. Marquey Mark never confronted him. Arnold was sent to New York, and General Cornwallis took the field. Marquey Mark said this: "This devil Cornwallis is much wiser than the other generals with whom I have dealt. He inspires me with a sincere fear, and his name has greatly troubled my sleep. This campaign is a good school for me. God grant that the public does not pay for my lessons." He admitted to Washington that the best he could do was shadow Cornwallis and dared not attack. Marquey Mark spends most of the spring and summer shadowing Cornwallis. He does attempt a sneak attack at Green Spring. Cornwallis realized he was vulnerable and did act quickly to remedy this. Both sides roughly lost 100 men. Marquey Mark retreats from battle, and then Cornwallis started to solidify his hold on Virginia. Cornwallis, with the British fleet and a large part of the British army, gathered at Yorktown. Marquey Mark wrote the French minister of the potential of trapping the British at Yorktown. He also wrote to Washington stating, "In the present state of affairs, my dear general, I hope you will come yourself to Virginia, and that if the French army moves this way, I will have at last the satisfaction of beholding you, myself, at the head of the combined armies. When a French fleet takes possession of the bay and rivers, and we form a land force superior to his, that army must soon or late be forced to surrender, as we may get what reinforcements we please." Unknown to our young hero, the father of this great nation was heading his way with 17,000 American and French soldiers. Marquey Mark besieged the British with Washington. His forces captured Redoubt 9, while Alexander Hamilton captured Redoubt 10, which forced the surrender. The young hero was there to receive the surrender of Cornwallis. In his own words, Marquey Mark had this to say: "The end of this campaign is truly brilliant for the Allied troops. There was a rare coordination in our movements, and I would be finicky indeed if I were not pleased with the end of my campaign in Virginia. You must have been informed of all the toil, the superiority, and the talents of Lord Cornwallis gave me, and of the advantage that we gained in recovering lost ground, until, at length, we had Lord Cornwallis in the position we needed in order to capture him. It was then that everyone pounced on him." Marquey Mark returned to France soon after the surrender of Cornwallis. Within a year's time, he had a daughter whom he named Marie Antoinette Virginie, upon Thomas Jefferson's recommendation. He was seen as a hero of two worlds, the old and the new. And with that, we conclude the early life of one Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, more commonly known as Lafayette. This is only the beginning of his life. He is such a monumental figure that I feel obligated to break up his life in two parts. He never loses his ideals, and his later life is in many ways more exciting than his early life. We will return to his later life at another time. Now, what I love about Lafayette is that this feels like a story of old, a myth. It is almost too wild to believe. There are so many archetypes here, and there's a lot of symbolism as well. Lafayette is essentially the son Washington never had. Washington is the father Lafayette got to actually know. I imagine this is such a great burden for Lafayette to live up to, and we see Lafayette live up to it and excel time and time again. Washington's trust in Lafayette is so supreme that one could argue that the fate of the nation rested on Lafayette's shoulders. What I find endearing about this is that Washington was willing to risk it all on this young man, and a young man from another country. Lafayette never gives up on his ideals, which rarely ever happens. One of his early foes is Benedict Arnold, America's greatest traitor. The juxtaposition of these two as foes is very poetic to me, and Lafayette's greatest temptation is set before him. The idea that he gets to avenge his father, something that had been instilled in him as a young man. However, Lafayette had the maturity and the strength not to fall for this. He wasn't blinded by revenge. He was painfully aware of what his mistakes could cause not only to his soldiers, but to the American people. He never took any pay during his time here in the States, and he spent his own money to fund the American cause and to take care of his men. And I just have to ask, how is this not a movie already? It writes itself, his life is prolific, and it's very inspiring and very just truly mythic. Now, if I were to compare Lafayette to someone from myth and folklore, I would say he is the American Galahad, if you will. Galahad was known for his gallantry and purity, and he was one of the knights of the Round Table that found the Holy Grail. Like Galahad, he surpassed the valor of his father. He remained true to his ideals his whole life, and I see the purity of his ideals as something we could compare to the purity needed to find the Holy Grail. Lafayette was in many ways the last true European knight. He is still embodying chivalry in a rapidly changing world. And not to jump the gun, but like many of the knights of the Round Table, Lafayette will have to watch his kingdom fall and have to stay true as dark times commence. And with that, my friends, let's conclude today's appreciation for one of America's greatest heroes, the one, the only, the hero of two worlds, Lafayette. Until next time, stay unapologetically American.